Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Travis. The name of the podcast is I Might Be Wrong. Thank you for joining me. In the Gospel of Luke, there's a story that's told by Jesus. And the story is really quite simple. A man is going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. And the road that he's on is a well-known road to the people that lived in that point in time, that day and age. It was a dangerous road. It was steep, it was isolated, and it was known for thieves. And this was well known. And so as Jesus is telling this story right from the very beginning, his audience is most likely drawn into it. And while he's on this road traveling alone, he's attacked, he's stripped, he's beaten, and he's left for dead. Jesus doesn't tell us the man's background. He doesn't tell us his ethnicity. He doesn't give any details as to what his moral history is, because the point of the story has really nothing to do with this man to some degree. It has more to do with the other characters that he's going to introduce. For all intents and purposes, he starts a story by telling a story about a body in a ditch, a body that's waiting to die. And the people understand the road that it's on, and they probably would have been well accustomed to hearing or seeing things just like this at that point in time in their day. Now, what happens next is something that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to the modern listener. Or the modern reader, because he introduces two other characters. One would be a priest, somebody who works in the temple, well known among the Jewish people, one of the people of highest reputation, one of the religious leaders of the day. And he also introduced a Levite. They don't both come at the exact same time. One passes and another passes the same road. Now, in a more Christianized Western world, we understand that if people are broken, the teachings of Christ has taught us that when you see somebody in these type of situations, we're supposed to reach out and help. And so the idea that some sort of religious leader of the day, somebody who was dedicated to working in the temple and doing those types of things, would pass by seems to be something that's terrible, sacrilegious, blasphemous almost. And yet, for the audience in Jesus' day, it would have made perfect sense that they did exactly what they did during this time, because their job was to remain clean so that they could perform temple duties. If somebody's dying on the side of the road, and possibly we know he's wounded because that happens later, that those details are brought to us later on in the story. Well, at that point in time, a priest or a Levite can no longer do what exactly he's supposed to do as a priest or a Levite. And so they're passing on the other side of the road. Now, for the audience that's listening to this during Jesus' time, this is something that's not unusual. And this is something that we need to understand as a modern listener. We tend to read a story like this or hear a story like this and interpret it through our lens in our day and age, and we see this as some sort of an evil, terrible person that's walking by him, when actually what they're doing is exactly what somebody's supposed to do if they were a good Levite, if they were a good priest, because their first duty above all things is to perform and do what they're supposed to do in the temple. And so the people listening wouldn't have sat there and grumbled and said to themselves, oh yeah, those priests, they're terrible people. Yeah, those Levites, they're terrible people. They wouldn't have thought it like this. And that's why it makes all the more sense that the next person that Jesus introduces into the story is a Samaritan, because the behavior that he engages in is the behavior of an outsider. This is somebody who doesn't belong among the religious community, and he's their ethnic enemy, and he behaves as such. For the Jewish listener listening to this, a Samaritan is doing all the things that somebody who is truly supposed to be a child of God, somebody who is supposed to be religious, would never do. Now, that's not necessarily saying that Samaritans were better people or anything like this. Jesus is intentionally opening this character up to them and giving him the identity of the enemy. He's making sure that they understand a Samaritan is here. A Samaritan to the Jewish people. They were the outsider. They were their religious and ethnic enemy. And what does this Samaritan do when he sees this person? He stops. He doesn't debate. He doesn't ask questions. He simply sees somebody who's wounded, and he moves towards the wound. He binds him. He lifts the man up. He takes care of him. He takes care of any cost there is needed in order to take care of him. And he promises to return. And then all of a sudden at the very end, Jesus twists everything around by asking a question. And the question is a really simple one. He says, which of these people proved to be the neighbor to the man who was in need? Not who qualified as a neighbor, not who became a neighbor. It's this really amazing shift. And this shift really matters because before Jesus tells the story, the lawyer is asking, there's a law expert asking Jesus, who is my neighbor? And Luke tells us why this man is asking the very question of who is my neighbor. It's not because he's trying to satisfy some curiosity. He wants to justify himself. And that's the tension. It's not curiosity, it's justification. And so when he's asking this question, he's actually asking a really important question because he understands that you're supposed to love your neighbor, that this is what God desires of people, that this is how we're supposed to treat other people, but he wants to understand, where does this responsibility reasonably end? What are the edges of this love? Who is my neighbor? When do I have to love, and when am I allowed to just simply not love? And I don't think that question has gone away at all. In fact, it's always in front of us as human beings. You see, before the lawyer ever asks about who his neighbor was, he asks Jesus another question prior to this. He's interested of Jesus to know, how do I get to heaven? And Jesus answers him and he says, well, you know the law. What does the law say? And the lawyer answers him perfectly. He says to him, love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus affirms it. 2 commandments. The first one, love God completely. The second one, love your neighbor. And Jesus says that these 2 things are all you need to do. He says he commends him for answering in this way. So there's 2 commandments, love God, love your neighbor. And the second one is like the first. Now that's so important to understand. The order they come in and the fact that the second one is like the first. It's not detached from it. It's not superior to it, and it's not floating free of it. Love of neighbor is structured by love of God, and that order matters. Because if love of neighbor is structuring what love of God looks like, or if our love of neighbor must come first, and then it's love of man, then it's love of God. No matter what it is that we're doing, when we do these things, what we're actually doing is we're taking the first commandment and we're weakening it. And when the first command weakens, the second one, it starts to drift. It starts to drift. And I honestly believe we're living in that drift. Because we live in a time where love your neighbor is celebrated. It's moral currency. You're commended for loving your neighbor. But loving God with all of your heart, soul, and mind, that's considered private, optional, maybe even unnecessary at times. And so empathy actually becomes the highest virtue. Empathy is what's good. But something subtle happens when empathy replaces love of God as our authority. What happens is love loses its anchor. Without God defining what love is, we begin defining it ourselves. And once that happens, there's shifts that occur. There's important shifts that occur. One of the first ones is I decide who my neighbor is and what counts as my neighbor. I also get to decide what love requires. And I get to decide when love becomes something that's too costly for me to bear. I get to define what love is, and that's exactly what the lawyer is doing prior to Jesus telling this parable. He wasn't rejecting the idea of love. He wasn't in any way saying it was a terrible thing. He was narrowing it. He was trying to put it into terms that worked for him. He was defining it by his own preferences, by his own desires. He might not have been twisting around the very definition of love, but he was twisting around who it was who he was allowed to love and who he could just reject. And simply by doing that, he's redefining love. Because what he's doing is detaching love from God. And when love is detached from God, it becomes something that's negotiable. And when it becomes negotiable, it becomes nothing more than an opinion. We don't stop believing in God. We just start correcting him, telling him who he's supposed to be and what he should represent. We reinterpret commands in the name of passion. We reinterpret all of the commandments and we reinterpret them in the name of our own compassion. Calling obedience harmful. We call boundaries unloving. We call discomfort, anything that brings discomfort becomes cruelty. Empathy quietly becomes the authority. And what feels humane overrides what God said tells us leads to life. Now we have to be careful there because empathy matters. Jesus had compassion. He wept. He touched lepers. He fed crowds of people. Empathy asks the question, why are you hurting and how are you feeling? And tries to understand exactly what everybody's going to. But the commands don't necessarily do this. They instead ask, what leads to life? Whereas empathy prioritizes immediate relief, God prioritizes long-term formation. And those things are not always compatible with one another in the moment. Because if somebody has a wound and they're hurting, and it's extremely painful, the only way that in many times that you can actually repair that is to go in with a piece of abrasive cloth or sometimes even a knife, and you have to open it up. That doesn't mean that you're a terrible person. When you have to do something like that, when you actually have to cause pain in order to help somebody, it can feel unkind. When a parent disciplines their child, it can feel very restrictive. When a teacher is correcting somebody, that can feel very uncomfortable. But a love that never confronts other people and it never confronts anything never heals. And when empathy becomes our highest authority, love becomes allergic to anything that's going to be discomfort, that's going to bring discomfort. And the only thing that really matters is how am I feeling? And if this makes me feel uncomfortable, or other people might interpret it in some sort of an odd way, then this no longer becomes love. And instead of pursuing love, we pursue comfort. And once love is defined only by comfort, it can no longer form anyone. Empathy is an amazing gift. I'm not saying it's bad. Empathy is an amazing gift, but it makes a terrible God. Because let's follow logic all the way through. If love is no longer grounded in God's character, then what anchors it? It's empathy. And if it's empathy, what is that? That's my feelings. That's your feelings. That's the cultural moment we live in right now. That's majority opinion. Love becomes something that's nothing more than subjective or selective or tribal. Who is my neighbor? The lawyer asked. And if I feel any sort of compassion, well, then I'll act. And if I don't feel any compassion, well, then I don't have to do anything. And if obedience conflicts with empathy, then obedience is always going to lose. And then eventually, love just simply becomes nothing more than something that is self-referential. It is just a reflection of my own desires. I'm no longer loving my neighbor as myself when it's not anchored to God and love of God. Actually, I'm just loving myself, and I'm doing it through the person of my neighbor. I'm no longer concerned with making sure that the world around me knows that there's a God who loves them and ministering Jesus Christ, and excited for the fact that one day, hopefully, people will conform to the image of Jesus Christ. I become much more convinced that the most important thing that they do is conform to my image of Jesus Christ. And this is what happens when we remove love from God. Without God, I should say, love just bends inward. It becomes a reflection of me and what I like and what I want. Even when it sounds generous, it's still just a reflection of me. And then I will create boundaries around it, and I will get to decide who's worthy of love and who's not worthy of love. I get to decide what love looks like and what it does not look like. The lawyer wanted these boundaries because we're comfortable with them. And what's fascinating is Jesus removed the boundaries. He removed them all. But here's the important key. Jesus could remove the boundary because love actually has a definition. And it's not something that's invented by us. Because you see, there's something else that's happening in the Good Samaritan story. We often hear it as some sort of a moral instruction, like be a good neighbor, cross the road, help the wounded. And that's true. But that's not the only thing that's going on, and that's not the only layer to this story. Because if this story is only instruction, well, it kind of becomes crushing. Because if the point is simply nothing other than go and do likewise, then we're left asking exactly like the same anxious questions that the lawyer himself is asking. We find ourselves asking, have I done enough? Have I loved enough? Have I crossed the road often enough? But Jesus is doing something deeper here. If we look again at the story, we see that there is a man beaten, broken, stripped, left half dead, cannot move toward anyone. He cannot save himself. He cannot even call out clearly. He is dependent completely on mercy. And that's not just a random character. That's us. Spiritually stripped, wounded by sin, both our sin and the sins of others, because you don't make it through this life without having to deal with the poisonous effects of sin. We're unable to lift ourselves out of a ditch. And here's the scandal of the story. The one who stops is the outsider. The one who stops is the rejected one. It's the Samaritan that Jesus introduces. He's the one that the religious insiders would never expect, and that's not an accident. Because the true Samaritan is actually Christ. He's the one who crosses the road toward people who would not cross toward him. He moves toward enemies. He binds wounds he didn't cause. He pours oil and wine, symbols of healing and cost. He lifts the man onto his own animal. He bears this man's weight. He pays his own resources, and he promises to return. That's not sentimental love. That's covenantal love. And it's costly, it's concrete. It's a self-giving, self-sacrificing love, and it flows from somewhere. Jesus' love for the wounded man flows from his perfect love for the Father. He does not act independently of God. He actually acts in obedience to God. His love of his neighbor, his love of the human race is anchored in his love of God. And this is the structure that we keep trying to reverse. We want the love of neighbor, we want love of neighbor without surrender to God. But the love we see in Christ cannot be separated from the Father. Over and over again in the Gospels, Jesus is telling us, I only do what I see my Father doing. I have come to do the will of him who sent me. My food is to do the will of my Father, which means when Jesus crosses the road towards sinners, he's not improvising compassion. He's embodying the love of God. And that matters, because if love is defined by Christ, then love has shape to it. Love is not mere affirmation. Love is not emotional agreement. It's not some type of a removal of any discomfort in our life. Love is willing the true good of another according to God's design, even at the cost of myself. It is self-sacrificing by its very nature. It's not just merely the idea that I'm going to go through my life trying to figure out who my neighbor is and who my neighbor isn't. It's not trying to figure out who's in and who's out. It's not trying to figure out what the definition is. Because it's given to us in the person of Jesus Christ. And in the person of Jesus Christ, that's what we see. It's voluntary. Voluntary self-sacrifice. And sometimes that means comfort. Comforting another individual. Sometimes that means that we're going to have to correct people. Sometimes that means sacrifice. Sometimes that means saying hard things. Think about it for a little while. Jesus comforts the weary, and yet he tells the rich young ruler to sell everything. He forgives the woman caught in adultery, and he tells her, go and sin no more. He touches lepers, and he overturns tables. Same love, same source. Love that is anchored in the holiness and mercy of God. So if you remove God from that equation, you don't actually get like a softer Jesus. You get a completely different one. One who affirms but doesn't transform. One who comforts but never calls. one who brings soothing to people, but he doesn't save. And that's not love. Because love that never confronts never heals. Love that never calls you out of the ditch leaves you in it. The Samaritan doesn't just sit beside the wounded man and validate his pain. He lifts him, he moves him, he carries him somewhere safe. He changes his condition, and he pays the cost himself. That's the definition of love that Jesus provides. It's not abstract, it's not sentimental, it's concrete, it's directional, and it's sacrificial, and it is anchored to God. So when we try to detach love of neighbor from love of God, we're not making love bigger. We're actually hollowing it out. Because without God's character defining love, we reduce it to nothing more than empathy. And empathy alone cannot bind wounds. It can feel them, but it cannot heal them. Only love anchored in truth can do that. And that's the love Jesus Christ shows us. That's the love that flows through us. We do not invent it, we receive it. We are first loved is what we read in the scripture, and it's because we are first loved that we love others. That means loving our neighbor is not some sort of an independent project. It's actually participating in the very love that God has given to us. Because the love that God gives to us is not meant to be harnessed and hoarded and buried in the ground like a treasure. It's meant to be shared and traded. It's meant to be increased on the earth. And there is no ability to truly love your neighbor apart from that source. Because apart from God, love is just going to be always self-reflection. It's just bending inward. It becomes about how I feel. It becomes about how I'm perceived. How I define what is good or what is not good. But when love is anchored in God, then it flows. It flows from being rescued from the ditch. It moves outward. It costs something. The very person of Jesus Christ. And it heals. And it forms. And it tells the truth. And it stays. That's love. And God is the one who provides the definition. So this is where this ultimately lands. There is no sustainable way to love your neighbor if love is separated from God. Because if love does not, because if God does not define love, we will. If God's not the one defining it, then I'm going to be the one. And if we define it, we will slowly conform it to our own preferences. We will soften the commands. We will redefine obedience. We will shrink responsibility. And we'll do all of this while calling it compassion. But when love is anchored in God, it flows from His character, His holiness, His mercy, His truth. Then love stops bending inward. It moves outward. It becomes costly. It becomes healing. It becomes concrete. The question isn't whether we talk about loving our neighbor or whether we will talk about loving our neighbor. We will. We will talk about it. But rather the question is whether we will let God define who our neighbor is. If we will let Him define what love is. And it's only at that point in time that it makes any sense. To love your neighbor as yourself makes no sense if it is not done with God. Because without Him, love becomes nothing more than an opinion. And with Him, love becomes life. Thank you, everybody, for joining me. Hey, if you got to this point, I would just really appreciate it if you just take a little time to like and subscribe, leave a comment, whatever else it is. You know how to help me out. Thank you all for joining me, and I'll see you later.